I would like to talk about the clinical use of fairy tales, and I give you quite a long introduction, and then I will show you in a practical case. Not only do parents, siblings, friends, partners, and children play their parts in our biographies, so do stories. Most of us have our favorite tales that we have heard or read. And you could now think, what kind of fairy tales did you love most, or what kind of tale did you read most? Oh, sorry for that. And most of us has been fascinated ever again by one or two particular stories. The stories that once captivated us, or still have a hold on us, contain messages about us, about our longings and our wishes. This tells us about attitudes and ideals that we would like to call our own, about the persons we would like to be. And if we take a closer look, these stories also contain messages about our problems, which show up very clearly in the characters of the story. And the same characters may also show us ways to solve our problems. Stories accompany us through life, and there are those whom one has the impression their stories are more real than their lives. Fairy tales now are stories that become part of our lives early in childhood. The fairy tale is a story, but not just any kind of story. In the fairy tale, a good deal happens that is nothing short of marvelous. Turns of fortune are possible that would be impossible in our lives. It's fabulous, we say, unbelievable, incredible, and in German we say it's märchenhaft. If something is turning out much better than we thought, we say it's märchenhaft. It's just like in a fairy tale. And at times, if secretly, we are glad if we can loosen the hold of reality's straitjacket a bit, allow ourselves to be carried along by a conviction that marvelous solutions of which we never dreamed of, and that means finally creative solutions, may yet present themselves against all odds. Now, by identifying with the fairy tale's protagonist, we are infected by this hope. We are infected by the hope that problems do indeed have solutions, that creative transformations are never something to rule out categorically. In this way, the fairy tale conveys the courage to be that can help us getting free of the tangles of the past in order to move on into the future awaiting us. The fairy tale is not just any kind of story for yet another reason. It comes from an oral tradition with more or less a long history. In the course of being handed down, details drop away that are unique to particular storytellers. The end product is a tale that is stripped down to themes that are clearly of interest to many persons. However, and we have heard this morning, this has not prevented editors of fairy tales collections, such as the Brother Grimm, to infuse their tales with their own convictions and points of view. Structurally, fairy tales typically begin with a problematic situation. For example, the lack of water of life. And you can imagine by yourself what that means if your life is dried out. Lack of water of life is the fairy tale expression for a depression. And then they show how the situation might be dealt with by describing processes that have to be suffered through. A path of growth emerges that leads through and out of the problem that was described at the outset. The fairy tale's protagonist symbolizes an attitude that is required to face a problematic situation. That means the protagonist have always to do on her own or on his own, which is possible, and then they have to expect help. The fairy tale addresses universal human issues by means of the protagonist, whose difficulties, trials, and adventures can be compared with our own. Only the fairy tale speaks to us in symbols and images, and that's now very important. The structural elements of a given narrative typically correspond to the stages and phases of psychological growth. Thus, fairy tales are closely related to myths, dreams, and unconscious processes in general, which are also in symbols and images. Myths, and I'm according to the famous Peter Smith about Stellung des Mythos, I don't know what it is in English. Myths express perennial human question, but also answers, encoded in a symbolic language, framed in a cosmic vision. Mythical stories conceal something essentially unspeakable within their narratives. Myths may also express the unique self-perception of a particular group. The mythic symbol forms a bridge between immanence and transcendence, and forms a link between the minute particulars and the sum of all the parts. The symbols that we encounter in fairy tales are somewhat closer to our immediate experience than those of myths. They speak to the banal and unique details of our lives, all the while pointing to the universality of our peculiar concerns. They show us roads that lead to a wellspring of that which is yet to be found. It is within this ground of being that we find the stuff to get us through our trials. The symbol now mixes experiences, psychic contents, and especially emotions into a sum total that cannot be represented in any other form. Thus, Bloch, the German philosopher Bloch, calls symbols categories of condensation. Although we never give up trying to interpret symbols, each attempt can only bring a partial aspect to consciousness. The symbol has a surplus of meaning. It is overdetermined. It reveals and opens up perspectives that gradually unfold before your eyes. That means, yet after we have said all that we can say, there still remains plenty that could be said. And that's why we can think about fairy tales even for centuries, I think. In the depth psychological interpretation of fairy tales, where which narrative events are viewed side by side with lifespan issues of emotional growth, we draw on many of the same techniques that are used to interpret dreams. For example, interpretation on the subjective level is of great service by having us look at the entire cast of the characters as sub-personalities of the protagonist. That means when a man meets a witch, we say that he is faced with a witch-like part of himself. Taking in turn different characters as the protagonist, we generate a number of alternative, complementary interpretative possibilities. Shining forth their meaning from many angles, symbols and fairy tales do not easily exhaust our interest. An interpretation that is true provides an experience of illumination and revelation. No interpretation can capture the sole truth, but it is consistent with itself and makes sense out of all of the narrative's most important features, then it contains truth. This kind of interpretation is playful. We enter into the play of reflecting on life, posing our existential questions, delving into psychic processes. In working with fairy tales in therapy, it is important to identify the primary concern that is unique to each fairy tale. This will help us in deciding on which of the many possible methods of interpretation may yield the most fruitful. In therapy, there is an attempt to create an environment in which the tale can speak to us at the level of imagination. Many of our inner images have become hardened and stereotyped. When they are softened in a therapeutic environment and become accessible to the input of the fairy tale, there is a chance that our prejudices and fixations may stand some alteration. Maybe the power of fantasy can even be revived. Through the funnel of the inner image, the fairy tale can have a huge impact on the chemistry of our emotional transformations. Thus, listening to a fairy tale already has a therapeutic effect, if we are receptive. The story's images work on us. Granted, some motives may strike us with greater immediate relevance than others. Those motives that speak to us are quickly taken possession of. We become their proud and jealous owners because they seem to express the way we feel in a way that nothing else can substitute for. For instance, we may be blocked by a feeling of emptiness and apathy. There is no way to express this feeling and no motivation to do so. The symbol of a fairy tale may lend its voice. A woman attempts to describe how she feels. Suddenly it occurs to her, I feel like the princess under the thorn bush, sleepy and incredibly prickly on the outside. This fairy tale image allowed her to become more articulate about her feeling of being in deadlock and the destructive rage that was connected to it. Soon she was also able to imagine how her emotional state might affect those around her. Unlike some feelings, the image is something that we can look at. In some respects, it is my image, but then again, it came from a source outside myself, from the fairy tale in our case. This paradox often provides us with the distance that is necessary to deal with the problem expressed in the image. The image of the princess in this thorn bush belongs to a magical type of tale whose narrative structure draws a conflict to a creative conclusion. Therapeutic work with fairy tales depends on this narrative process. We take our own images and enter them into a developmental program that is encoded with the hope characteristic of fairy tales that difficulties can be overcome. According to Bloch, every living symbol, and that means every symbol that speaks to us, contains the hope that is encapsulated in the archetype. Surely, therapy should be about the business of making this power of the human psyche available. There are a number of ways of working with fairy tales in psychotherapy. We can work with the stories or the motifs that have always been a part of our lives, that connect us with our childhood and biography. We can use them to confront issues stemming from childhood and see if they offer any suggestions for how to deal with them. The idea of a fairy tale or a specific motive of a fairy tale coming up in the analyst's mind can also be used. And it is in a certain analytic situation, it can be seen in a certain analytic situation as a special form of countertransference, I would say as an archetypal countertransference. Or we can use the fairy tale as a mirror to examine our present predicaments. Then again, we can use the fairy tale as a means for stimulating a creative process of symbolization, a kind of imagination guided by the fairy tale. In short, encounters with the symbols of fairy tales provides a forward thrust by dislodging the wedges that have blocked emotional development. It is a work that allows us to hope. By seeing our personal concerns in the mirror of this extended narrative cosmos, we are reintegrated into a community that shares the belief that solutions can be found, in connection with our personal fantasy in relation to a kind of collective human fantasy. Now, I would like to give you a clinical example. Anne Allison was a 49-year-old woman in business, married with 2 adult children. Originally, she began analysis because she could not free herself of a deep-seated feeling of emptiness in life, in spite of major success in business. She thought that this feeling of her life as empty and trivial must be signs that she was having a midlife crisis. Her crisis must hit somewhat later than in other people's lives. She had avoided the unhappiness of the empty nest syndrome, that was her words, by burying herself, also her words, in the business that she had inherited from her father. She appeared confident to me, highly motivated, a bit wiry. Dreamy eyes contrasted with her tight face and her nice, modest clothing. Her feeling of emptiness did not come across right away. At the first, I felt rather confused. I had no idea where to begin, and I felt pressured to get right down to business. Taking these feelings as my starting point, I spoke with her about how we might work together. We would be finding out together what life wanted from her. Her dreams and fantasies would be of interest, and we would have to pay careful attention to what was going on between us. I ended my speech, and it was a sort of speech I usually do not do. I ended my speech by saying that we needn't worry so much about making the grass grow. The grass will grow of its own accord. Our job would be to pick the stones out the field. She responded by assuring me that she would understand if I had any reservations about investing so much time in her. She wasn't convinced that she was, her words, a worthwhile project. I asked her if she was ready to invest time and energy, and as she was ready if I was also ready. This conversation stayed with me. It did not fit together with the impression of motivation that she otherwise conveyed. I was left with the feeling that I would have to talk her into finding life worthwhile. She had communicated her inner state of emptiness. Following this introduction, we worked on her conflicts with her children. Most of this resolved around her daughter, who took so much for granted, helped herself to whatever she could get her hands on, and failed to live up to her mother's idea of morality. We made several attempts to see connections between this situation and her own childhood. Throughout, the Anne Allison's mother remained a strangely indefinite figure. She had given birth to 7 children, 2 of whom she lost to polio at 2 and 3 years of age. She was a hard worker, but she always hummed a tune to herself. When I asked her to describe this in more detail, she told me that they weren't so much real songs as melancholy themes. She didn't recall if it was possible to have any conflicts. Her mother always gave in. She had not seen much of her father. He had been preoccupied with his business. As she grew older, he would talk to her about what was going on in the business. He praised her budding sense for business affairs. As the second eldest child, she was her father's confidant. Her elder sister has established a stronger bond with mother. After her apprenticeship, the Anne Allison worked steadily in her father's business, and after he retired, she took it over and restructured it. That was 8 years ago. Her father had at first been skeptical about the changes she made, but then increasingly proud. Now and then she brought a dream, which we worked over in depth. Our relationship was friendly, but I kept asking myself why she was in analysis and whether this was really the right thing for her. She treated me as if I were a mother with many children to take care of. She went out of her way not to be a burden. This made me feel inwardly aggressive. I told her that I felt so protected by her that it was starting to go on my nerves. Had she felt this way toward her mother? All such interpretations, which seemed correct to me and gave me a measure of relief after saying them, received her kind and patient consideration. The first 45 hours of therapy brought about a change in her feelings toward herself. It made her happy when she remembered dreams. We worked on each dream with the help of imagination. That means I would invite her to enter back into the dream images and to let the feelings in these images take hold of her again and to talk about. Some changes could have been noticed. She began to take more time for her personal life. She became more aware of how she felt about different members of the personal family. She felt her aggressive feelings in the right moment and tried to express it. She discovered more patience for her daughter, and she felt that she was making a lot of progress in therapy. After about a year of therapy, during which she came twice a week, except during long breaks when she or I was gone, she brought a dream that shocked her. It is the 45th hour, and the dream in her words: I am at the town square. My hands are to be cut off. I am terrified. It really happens. Someone cuts off my hands. It doesn't hurt as much as I expected. But now what should I do? I can't go on without hands. She started from her sleep with a scream. After listening to the dream, her husband assured her that it was absolutely possible to live without hands. And she should go back to sleep. This response infuriated her. She told me that she even had the fantasy of cutting his hands off. This fantasy made things worse. She didn't know that she had such an aggression for him. But then again, neither did she feel any particular love. Their erotic life had seen better days. But otherwise, they were well suited to each other. The morning after the dream, she wanted to call me. But when she thought about how her husband had reacted to her anxiety, she was afraid that I would find it overblown as well. So she came to the session 4 days later. She told me the dream without emotion. But the dream alarmed me. I got the emotion she suppressed. Its emotional quality was totally different from any of her other dreams. She perceived the shock it caused me. She noticed my ripple of emotional insight. So this is the hidden problem in this person's life. She said, I suppose I could have called you after all, describing how her husband had made her feel. Then we entered into the images of her dream in the usual way. The town square reminded her of the church square in which she had grown up, as well as the square in her present neighborhood. The square in the dream was different in that it had no trees or other surroundings. This dream square made her feel uneasy. It was so barren and cold. She was not sure who had cut off her hands or exactly where that had happened. But the image of being without hands was very clear. The blood too. Despair. She would never be able to live without hands. For the first time, she broke down and cried. I asked her to allow as much space as possible for the feeling that came with the image of cut-off hands. Then she should see if she could put it into words. Now, in her words, I have no more hands to give to anyone. I'm becoming completely dependent on others. I feel so helpless. I can't reach out and take anything for myself. I cannot reach out to anyone else and touch them. Talking is the only way I know how to relate. My business is not the problem. The problem is I can't use my hands to comfort anyone. And I can't hit with them either. I don't come near anyone with my hands. If I did, they would cut them off. I asked who the they referred to. Her husband, she replied, who told her she was being hysterical. Her brother, she had asked him if he would like to sell part of the business that he was having trouble with. Don't get your hands mixed up in my stuff, he told her only about a week ago. This response cut too quick. She only wanted to help. He was jealous, she realized. After all, she had enjoyed much greater success than he. A memory occurred to her. Once she wanted to help her mother take care of an infant. Keep your dirty hands away, her mother snapped. A stream of memories was unleashed, all having to do with not being able to lend a hand or take what she wanted from life. Once she wanted to go dancing. Her father shamed her, not simply by forbidding. He told her that if she wanted to act like a primitive, there was nothing that he could do about it. Naturally, she did not want to seem primitive to her father. Suddenly, she realized that she had turned her childhood feelings against her own daughter, whom she had prevented from ever being able to take anything for herself. At most, she had been allowed to take if it spelled achievement. For the first time, she felt admiration for her daughter, who hadn't let her hands be cut off. I myself, too, had cut off her hands, in part by not allowing her to treat me with kid gloves. I had rejected her gentle touch. It was no wonder she had not dared to reach out to me after the horrible dream. The theme was now constellated. Her recall of the past in terms of this symbol was more intensely lit up with emotion than ever before. We also understood the analytical relationship in terms of this image. Could therapy end up being a crippling experience, taking away her hands? We would say the complex of severed hands was constellated, especially in relation to her husband, but also to work colleagues. Her reactions to my limits or supposed limits were overblown, and the complex confused me with some from work who had been cutting her off. It became increasingly difficult for me to get hold of anything at all in our work, and I ended up keeping my hand off of everything. So I had also the hands cut off. In the 61st hour, I asked her to imagine what she would like to do with her hands. I eased her into a guided fantasy by inviting her to touch and caress her own hands. She said, I wish my hands could stroke and comfort. I think there are times when I could express my feelings so much better with my hands than with my tongue if I could only caress. I want to walk together with someone hand in hand. I want to feel warmth. I want to give warmth. That is only something I have been able to do with my children. I was always too embarrassed to do it with adults, but I wouldn't be anymore. Do you find it embarrassing? I assured her that I don't find it embarrassing. It makes for a feeling of trust. She spoke at length about her longing to trust. If only she could just take a hug or a kiss for herself. And she became poetic in describing a warm relationship in which she could get what she wanted. She must learn to help herself in life, she resolved. She should be less influenced by what others think is right. Her daughter posed a challenge here. Could she hold on to what she thought was right? My intervention not only put the past in a new light, the imaginative exercises brought alive the dimension of anticipation that was also part of the symbol. Invited to consider what she would like to do with her hands, she began to long for a relationship that would make life more satisfying. But her longing was miles from fulfillment. On center stage at the moment was a woman with her hands cut off. On the one hand, this was a woman who was repeatedly stopped from taking what she wanted. But on the other hand, it was a woman who could not help herself to what she wanted. She could not arrange her personal life the way she wanted. Slowly, the quality of her desperation began to change. It became less of an outward grasping and more of an inward grappling. One day she asked, "Am I the only one with this problem?" In response, I told her the fairy tale called The Girl with No Hands. And as I do not like so much the Grimm version of it, because it's so Christian, I told her the version that is still a part of the German fairy tale tradition. And please, Samuel, would you read now this fairy tale?
The Girl Without Hands. There was once a widower who lived alone in a cottage with his only daughter. His neighbour was an old woman who had also been widowed. The man's daughter took great delight in visiting the old woman. She would have her beautiful hair combed and in return offer help with all the household tasks. One day the girl pleaded with her father to marry the widow woman, and after a long period of indecision, he agreed to do what she asked. The widow woman happily consented, and the marriage was arranged. On the wedding day, the widow woman brought along her only daughter as an unexpected guest. The two girls became friends and spent the next years growing up and playing together. Eventually they reached the age to be married and were faced every day by a constant stream of enthusiastic suitors. Sadly, however, the man's daughter was far more beautiful than the widow woman's, and the suitors naturally threw their gaze and their admiration onto her. The widow woman became bitter and resentful. So bitter and so resentful that she decided to have her stepdaughter killed. She knew that every day the girl would take food to her father in the forest, so made an agreement with some local thieves to have her caught and killed there. On the appointed day, the thieves stopped the girl as she walked through the forest. "Where are you going?" they asked her bluntly. "I'm taking this food to my father," she replied. They told her that she could go, but that she must return exactly the way she came. When she reached her father, she was distraught. "Why are you crying?" he asked. But the girl did not dare reply, and ignoring the concern of her father, turned straight round and began her journey back through the forest. Once again the thieves barred her way. They began to argue amongst themselves about what should be her fate. She wept so bitterly that they felt unable to kill her, but they also knew the old woman would demand proof of their contract. "We'll poke out her eyes," one said. "No, we'll rip out her tongue," said another. The third thief found the solution. "We'll hack off her hands." And so they did, and then they let her go. For a long time after, the girl wandered through the forest, shocked, tired, and hungry. Finally, she stumbled into an orchard full of fruit trees. She had no hands now with which she could pick the fruit, and so standing on tiptoe, she bit into the apples and pears which hung invitingly from the branches. Little did the girl know that the orchard belonged to a king, and in a short time this same king appeared walking amongst the trees. As he walked, he noticed that some of the fruit on the lower branches had been bitten into. He wondered what sort of animal might be responsible, and so, late in the evening, he came back to keep a careful watch. In the moonlight, he saw the girl with no hands. She was waiting quietly for the wind to blow, so that the branches would bend towards her. When they did, she bit deep into the hanging fruit. The king, intrigued, announced himself and asked the girl how she had arrived in his orchard. Fearfully, she told him of her terrible experience in the forest, of how she'd lost her hands, of how hungry she was, and how she'd stumbled into the orchard. The king, in listening to her, became entranced. He felt such sympathy for her that he took her back to his castle and offered his hand in marriage. The girl accepted and became his wife. Not long after this, the king was called to war, and while he was away, his wife gave birth to twins. Now in his castle also lived the queen mother, who loathed the sight of these children. She wrote to the king, her son, in the midst of his battles, to say that his wife had given birth to a dog and a cat. The king was shattered, and believing the Queen Mother's lie, sent a message back to the castle ordering his wife to be killed. The children were bound to their mother's breast with cloth, and she was driven away into the wilderness. For a whole day she wandered, pining for food and for drink. Towards evening she came to a fountain, but just at the moment of putting her lips to the sparkling water, she noticed a sign above the fountain which said, "Whoever drinks from this fountain will turn into a deer." She resisted her thirst and wandered sadly on until she came to a second fountain. As she leaned over to drink, one of her children slipped from her chest and almost fell into the water. She instinctively reached into the fountain with her handless arm to save the child. As she did so, she felt her hand growing back under the water. She dipped her other arm in, and that hand was restored too. The woman was greatly relieved. She continued to wander, and as darkness fell, she decided to climb up into a tree to see if she could spot a light in the distance. And there was a light, a long way off, but still visible. She followed its direction, and finally she came to a house. The door was open, and inside there was a long table set with much food and drink. Without hesitation she sat down with her children and ate, and afterwards they lay down to sleep. The only other inhabitants were a cow and several chickens who'd been living there for 7 years without seeing another soul. Meanwhile, the king was bitterly regretting his decision to drive his wife away, and after 7 years he dreamed that he'd found her whilst out hunting in the forest. He trusted the dream, and summoning his servant, set out on horseback to look for her. He found the house where she was, and not recognizing her, because she now had hands, asked her for lodging. She recognized him, but said nothing. The king and the woman ate supper together that night. Afterwards, as her guests lay sleeping, she and the children decided to work, plucking feathers from the chickens. The king's servant, however, was not asleep, and kept a secret watch over her. He listened carefully to what she was saying to her children. As the king lay sleeping, one of his arms dropped down over the side of the bed, and the woman said to her youngest, "Go over there and lift your father's arm back into bed." The little boy couldn't manage this by himself and asked his brother to help. But then the king's foot slipped out and hung over the side of the bed. Again the mother said, "Go over there and lift your father's foot back into bed." And once again the little boy needed his brother to help. Finally the king's head hung over the side. The woman sent the children, but they couldn't lift it by themselves. So she crossed the room, kissed the king's forehead, and lifted it back herself onto the bed. The next morning the king thanked her for her hospitality and set out with his servant to continue the hunt. While they were riding through the forest, the servant told the king what he had seen and heard in the night. The king returned to the house a second time, and once again asked for board and lodging. He was received kindly along with the servant, and the woman gave them a delicious supper. The king ate, and then lay down to sleep, but this time he was pretending. He left his arm hanging over the side of the bed as before, and heard himself, the woman, say, "Go over there and lift your father's arm back into bed." He felt the effort of the children as they tried to do what their mother asked. He then let his feet hang down and heard and felt the same things. Finally, he let his head hang over and felt the woman coming towards him, felt her kiss his forehead, and lift his head gently back onto the bed. At last the king opened his eyes. He asked her how she had known who he was. He was still unsure as to whether the woman was truly his wife, and so she showed him the scars on her arms as proof. The king was overjoyed. He sent for the royal coach and drove home to his castle with his re-found wife and children. They lived happily ever after.
Thank you, Sanu. This fairy tale is found in many parts of the world, and generally it consists of the following narrative elements. The heroine's hands are severed. The reason in different versions of the tale are: she will not marry her father, she will not marry her brother, her father has sold her to the devil, she gives alms against her father's expressed will, her sister-in-law is jealous and slanders her, her stepmother or mother is jealous. These are all reasons why the hands are cut off. A second part, which is always there, the heroine leaves the place of her misery and comes to a court of a king, and the king marries her. A third element, she becomes pregnant and the king is called into war just as she's about to give birth. I think we have to think about ogres in this case. Now she is banished a second time after someone mixes up letters or gives false information. Depending on the version, this may be her mother and father-in-law, it can be her father, it can be her mother, it can be her sister-in-law, or it can be the devil. The fourth element, which is always there, after a long period of hardship and wandering in the forest, a miracle causes her hands to grow back, as a rule in connection with her care and concern for her children. And the fifth element, the king returns from war and searches for his wife and children, and they find themselves. So the fairy tale suggests that various situations can lead to a feeling in life that our hands have been cut off and that we have to go on without them. As if victims of some horrible tragedy, we make our way in the world without hope. We resign ourselves to being crippled. And yet this woman always find their way to an orchard where they can nourish themselves. There they meet a king and join up with him. But naturally matters are not so easily resolved. The old problem returns. The complexes rear up their heads again. New possibilities now exist, symbolized in the newborn children, but the hands have not yet grown back. A development has taken place, but the problem can only be resolved once the hands are restored. It is not only through devotions to the children, but also by taking matters into her own hands that the hands grow back. Resolve to never let the children be taken away again gives her the power to trust in life. The hands grow back through the certainty that nothing can come between her and the children, the future. Strangely enough, this fairy tale suggests that the problem of severed hands prevents an easy alliance with the man. The heroine has to leave the king again and return to a spell of loneliness lasting 7 years. The tale suggests that the very thing that holds us together must also be sacrificed. Perhaps this sacrifice is necessary because her original reaching in most tales for the father or brother had been all too quick. Now, I guided my analysant into a state of deep relaxation that allowed her a vivid experience of the images of the tale, and then I told her the tale as I had it in my mind. It was not that complete as Samuel did it, so I had to give what I had. At first, she was very surprised to discover that the image of her dream corresponded to a common motif of fairy tales. But the fairy tale has a solution, she noted with joy, and what a crazy one. She only has to stop believing that she cannot take things into her own hands. The first thing that struck her about the tale was the father's failure to pay more attention to his daughter's feelings. She, the daughter, had cried, but he didn't ask really for an explanation. He completely missed the danger she was in. The analysant's emotional reaction to this, at first, consisted of regret, followed by anger. Various memories arose, which I will not describe here, in her relationship to her father. Then she became preoccupied with the scene in which the mother is dying of thirst. When one of her children nearly slips into the water, she forgets that she does not have any hands. The analysand played and replayed this scene in her imagination. At first she thought that she was just playing it back like a recording. Although she found this uncreative and emotionally dishonest, the images would not leave her. Sometimes they would even flash in her mind during business meetings, to her great joy and surprise. Suddenly she understood why the girl without hands could not stay at the king's court. She could not assume responsibility for her, both for herself and for his children. The court was really his, not hers. The fact that he had left in her hands meant that he was not more capable of taking his life into his hands than she was. It was somehow more natural to him to war with his hands than to care. The analysand applied these thoughts to her concrete situation. She kept having the feeling that someone was cutting her hands off. But gradually, the certainty was growing in her heart that we can come to our own aid when we are in danger of losing something that we are sure belongs to us. Slowly it was dawning on her what the children, as symbols, really meant to her at this time in her life. Through her imaginative journeys, she realized that they corresponded to a newly discovered affection for people, animals, and life in general. Slowly she lost the sense of having her hands cut off. She began to feel that her hands were tied, but only in specific moments. Since we had begun working with the fairy tale, a noticeable change had taken place in the therapeutic relationship as well. For one thing, she stopped accusing me of cutting off her hands. Most importantly, the fairy tale gave us a new focus. Both of us turned our attention to the tale. On the one hand, I was accompanying her in her imagination, entering into her images and feelings, but at the same time, I was developing my own images and feelings that had some degree of influence on those of the analysand without my expressing them. She learned also to make better use of me. She would ask me to tell her a certain part of the tale again and again. Or she would describe how she saw a certain passage and then ask me if I could see it in that way too. She became much less dependent on my judgment, or at least on what she assumed to be my judgment. She became clear, more assertive, and also more affectionate in therapy, and she found these changes easy to translate into her life. Her feelings of emptiness loosened their hold of her. The analysis continued out of her own self-curiosity. Some concluding remarks. Working with fairy tales and myths allows us to make use of the images and the image-spawning process that reside in the motives of the human imagination. But I think we can only do so when a comparable symbol has been activated in our own psyche and when we enter the fairy tale at an emotional level. That means with imagination or with paintings or with playing. These images stimulate our own fantasy, laying us open to the infectious power of hope that is expressed in so many tales. Fairy tales have the power to convince analysands that even their problems are not irresolvable, no matter how similar they may seem. A symbolic process, such as expressed in a fairy tale, can take on the function of a transition object, how Winnicott describes it. Working with fairy tales can relieve the burden on the relationship with the therapist. Instead of looking at each other, we look at a third party. But working with fairy tales can also be seen as an effort to indicate what is behind the relationship, what is behind concrete, everyday reality. Finally, it indicates the overall primary cause accessible in the symbol and particularly in the symbolic processes expressed in fairy tales. In this respect, I see the supporting elements of the collective unconscious which become accessible to us in fairy tales and myths, and which we can provide to others so that the problem might be reworked. And this also has an effect on the structure of the ego, or of the ego complex. Only rarely do we copy the solution offered by the image of the fairy tale. I think fairy tales spark imaginative processes that are unique to each individual. They alter deeply entrenched feelings and accompany us in the practical business of restructuring our daily lives. Thank you for your attention.